Nicodemus here. On today's episode, you were discussing the chalice, and I want you to go more in depth with that. So lay it on me.
Yeah, well, it started with the video you sent of the chalice. So Nicodemus sent over a video, and it was a cool hypothesis, and I'll summarize it quickly, is that at the Last Supper, the chalice, where Jesus says, is offer this of my blood. I guess in Judaism, what they were talking about in the theory was that when a husband and wife got married, the husband would leave and go to prepare. They would drink of the same cup, and then the husband would leave and go to prepare the place for the wife. So that was traditional in Judaism. And then the theory was that when Jesus was saying, okay, drink of my blood, I'm going to go prepare a way in my Father's house. My Father's house has many rooms, all of this. I'm not a Bible scholar, but I think a lot of you know these, right? I just grew up on these. I'm going to go. My Father's house has many rooms. I'll prepare the way for you. Well, it's very interesting because in the cameos in A Course in Miracles that we talked about, there's in one of the cameos, Jesus, in speaking to Helen, brings up this chalice, and he calls it the chalice list. Now, I want to bring maybe a different interpretation to that theory of the Last Supper, because think about this for a moment. Christians, sincere Christians, could hear that and go, well, Jesus is going to prepare a way for me. If you don't believe in Jesus, you're screwed. I mean, I'm using my own language, but I think you understand what I mean. And now you see how we can use even that story of the chalice and preparing the way and drinking of the chalice for specialness, for judgment, for separation. You see how subtle the ego can be. So I'd like to add an additional way of seeing this, which Jesus gives us some idea around this and speaking to Helen in one of the cameos. And he talks, so Helen now really doesn't like one of Bill's friends. He really dislikes him. So Jesus is talking to Helen of, you need to offer the chalice to him, and talked about a chalice list. And don't we all have a chalice list of people in our life that you need to offer the chalice? And it's really the chalice of forgiveness. Because in some later cameos, some of the cameos are titled this, and in some of Jesus' communication to Helen about her relationship with Bill also is that he would say, you don't realize how much you hate each other. And I think that there's something, we don't realize the depth of attack that we have in our minds for each other, for the world, our judgments. So this chalice is really where the forgiveness 70 times 7 comes in the Bible. Like if you know that story with Matthew and Simon, some of you that like to watch The Chosen, it's about forgiving 70 times 7, really infinite forgiveness. So in this, one of the things that Helen, in one of Bill's friends says, I feel extremely negative toward him, and I insist that he's a bad influence on Bill. And I think he's a real menace to me. Like how many of we all have people like that in our life, right? It's like, I mean, come on, I could think of a list of people in my lifetime that I've had or thought like that, right? And one of the things that I want to just some of Helen's notes on this, and he said, Jesus now answers Helen's question about this, his name was Wally, being on her list. And he says, you of all people should know that it frightens people if you hand them back their own chalice. Like if you don't offer your chalice and you hand it back to them. And this was actually in, he says, there's a sub footnote. It says the whole problem is that they threw away their chalice and are denying it. Therefore, they're now afraid of it. This should cause you no trouble at all in understanding. So let's just think about that for a moment. So what Jesus is saying, and that was the sub note, and let me just go back to this note here. He says, you of all people, to Helen, should know that it frightens people if you hand them back their own chalice. Whether he is or not depends on a 3-way readiness. Like he needs to be ready, right? So go back to The Chosen, right? Matthew needs to be ready. Peter. I don't remember if it was Peter at that time. No, he was Simon still. So that was in season 3. So remember, Simon becomes Peter.
Oh, yes.
Right? So Matthew and Simon doesn't like Matthew because Matthew was a tax collector. I'm telling you the story of the Chosen. I love how the Chosen did this too. So Matthew needs to be ready. Simon needs to be ready. Jesus is always ready, which is what he says. He says, whether he is or not depends on a 3-way readiness. I am always ready. Your job is to take care of your readiness. His readiness is up to him. At present, he is a potential candidate. So this potential is italicized. And it says now the whole problem, I want to go back to the footnote. The whole problem is that they threw it away and are denying it. Therefore, they're now afraid of it. This should cause you no trouble at all in understanding. So how does this relate to us in our lives? The 3-way readiness. So what Jesus is saying is that Jesus is always ready to teach us miracles and forgiveness. It's up to us for us to be ready. Whether the other person is ready or not really doesn't matter in the end. Now, I love this line that Jesus says to Helen. He says, therefore, they are now afraid of it. This should cause you no trouble at all in understanding. Because how many times have we been not ready? And how many times have we been afraid of others and, them hurting us? And I mean, all of this. But he's saying to Helen, this should cause you no trouble at all in understanding. First off, we can understand it, but I also read it from a different perspective. This should cause us no trouble at all for brothers and sisters are ready or not for the chalice. So what Jesus is saying is it's up to us to offer the chalice of forgiveness. And that's really the teaching, right? Because even in the story of the Last Supper, Jesus drank of my blood, this is all symbolic, if you will. It's really about drinking of the chalice of forgiveness, which is what Jesus' whole teaching is. Which is why in the Course, Jesus says forgiveness is the only path. So a 3-way readiness. Jesus saying he's always ready. It's up to us for us to be ready. And whether the other person's ready or not really doesn't matter. And if they're afraid of the chalice, if they're attacking back, all of that in the end doesn't affect us at all. So that's why the teaching, that's why he says the atonement, forgiveness is the only device that doesn't have a double-edged sword that cuts us. Any other device you use in the world always has the potential to hurt you. Forgiveness is the only device that does it, because forgiveness ultimately wakes us up from the idea that we can even be hurt by anyone or anything in the world. That's the true meaning of the chalice.